Hello, I'm Scott Roth, the instructor for HI 152, American History from the Civil War to the present. Just wanted to welcome you to the class, and a couple things I do want to go over on this welcome video. One are some of the general themes we're going to discuss this term. Another, I want to provide some background up to the Civil War. Now, a few themes. Compromise. An old colleague of mine once said, the history of America is the history of compromise, and I think you'll see that especially up until the Civil War. And our government relies on compromise to make any kind of progress. It's very much important in a nation as diverse as ours. Also, the idea of American exceptionalism, that our country is different from all others. Now, when I say this, I don't mean America is the best country ever and nobody is ever going to be as good as us and yada, yada, yada. I'm saying we're exceptional. We're different. There is a continuing conflict. States' rights versus a strong federal government authority. We'll touch upon that. And again, diversity. And diversity really mandates compromise. Now, why did people come to the New World? Why did people come to the colonies early on? For some, it was economic opportunity. For some, it was escaping religious oppression. Remember, we don't have religious freedom when people first come to the colonies. Rhode Island would be the first colony that would truly have religious freedom. But people came here because they were trying to escape oppression in Europe. And we'll talk about that here a little bit. Those who peopled the New World, as far as what would become the colonies, established four distinct regions. Now, New England, the Middle Colonies, the Upper South, and the Lower South, each with a different economic and cultural reality. In New England, farming and a little bit of trade ruled the day, especially as Massachusetts Bay Colony began to grow in the early 17th century. John Winthrop, a founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, sought to establish what he called a city upon a hill, the perfect community that could serve as an ideal for all others, not just in the colonies, but in Europe. And that was his goal, to show Europe how it's done, if you will. But this Commonwealth started mostly by Puritans and some Pilgrims, the difference being Puritans wanted to modify and purify the Anglican Church, whereas the Pilgrims simply wanted to separate. Now, this Commonwealth was anything but about freedom of religion. Most came to this region to escape religious oppression in Europe, as I mentioned, but established an official church in New England. Though it was Congregationalism, which was a decentralized authority, and each church essentially was autonomous, this was very much unlike the Catholic Church or even the Church of England as things came about. But again, this is not about free religion. There is an official church in New England. It was illegal to not attend services. Those who were not Puritans were often marginalized, if not outright banned. Those who challenged Puritanism with other religions were often banished. Roger Williams and John Clark would help to establish Rhode Island as a station for true religious freedom. They welcomed those who were banished by Massachusetts Bay Colony, even somebody like Anne Hutchinson. But those who stayed in Massachusetts Bay Colony and tried to convert Puritans, well, they faced some trouble. For example, there were some Baptists. Clark is one of them, and two of his Baptist cohorts, Obadiah Holmes and John Crandall, went to Lynn, Massachusetts to try to convert residents to their religion. Now, when they were found out by authorities, they were fined and threatened with whipping if they did not leave the area. Holmes suffered a whipping, and the three left immediately thereafter. Quakers were treated no better. Quakers Christopher Holder and John Copeland returned to Massachusetts Bay Colony after being whipped and banished in hopes of sharing their version of Christianity. Authorities arrested them, cut off an ear of each of them, and banished them upon pain of death. From that point forward, any Quaker who was banished but returned was subject to trial and the death penalty as the punishment. So if you were banished, if you're a Quaker and you're banished and you come back and you're caught and you're found guilty, it's the death penalty. Now, the Middle Colonies were comprised of what would become New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. It was initially settled by the Dutch and the Swedes. The English would seize the area in 1664. Theirs was a diverse population which practiced religious toleration. The Upper South consisted of Maryland and Virginia, the former serving as an outpost for Catholics in the New World. These colonies focused on tobacco. The lower or deep South included Georgia and the Carolinas and was a society based around yeoman farmers. Now, agriculture here was labor intensive. Crops like sugar, rice, and later cotton were quite labor intensive, and this necessitated many workers at a cheap rate. Indentured servants were a large part of this working force in the New World, but slavery would become a staple in the South due to the soil and its resulting crops. This is important because slavery was an economic institution. It was absolutely immoral, we know that. but it was an economic institution, and it was fostered by the type of soil and the type of crops grown. Again, it was a labor-intensive area. Now, these colonies represented the foundation of the young nation, and they represented some of the diversity we see. We have small farms up north, plantations in the south, a variety of crops grown and traded, people from different religions and parts of Europe. From the very beginning, we were a diverse nation. Now, this is one example of American exceptionalism. No other modern nation was created this way. The states, as we understand them today, were mostly developed or boundaried well before our nation was born. The modern idea of nation-state is actually quite recent, but even so, the tribes or people who had lived in the specific regions in Europe, for example, remained with the nation-state that developed out of the city-states and the feudal era. We are the only nation peopled initially by immigrants. This allowed for what we will later discuss as manifest destiny. There was a frontier, there was new land to be explored and cultivated, unlike those in Europe, Asia, or Africa, in which the lands had already been claimed for centuries. This is not to downplay the fact that Native Americans were already here, but as far as the origins of the United States, no other nation developed this way. Now, worthy of note here during this time is the changing status of women in the Western world. I highly recommend Mary Beth Norton's Separated by Their Sex for those interested in what was happening in the U.S., and Thomas LaCour's Making Sex for those who like European history better. Now, LaCour is quite thick reading, but it is quite illuminating when we look at the women's movement internationally. Prior to 1700, these and other historians argue there was no consideration of two sexes. Rather, men and women were the same in nature but different in degree. After 1700, a new two-sex model developed which separated the two. Part of this is due to the Enlightenment and the pervasive focus on classification and order. Prior to this time, women did participate in public issues and politics. Exclusion was more about class than gender. Thus, women like Lady Frances Berkeley were active and defended her, and she in specific defended her role in Bacon's Rebellion. After 1700, a change occurs. Publishers like John Dunton and Richard Steele pushed the idea of differentiation between the sexes. Women were to study virtue and piety, and the household was to be their jurisdiction. The woman's place was as wife and mother, and we see the origins of the term fair sex at this time. Public discourse was to be relegated to men, as women were of a different intellectual nature, not necessarily inferior, equal but different, if you will. And their nature was about education and comfort, their responsibilities in the private sphere. Also important was the Industrial Revolution. This changed family life completely. No longer did families work together at home. They worked, whether working on crafts or more likely in agriculture, but men were now going off to work and laboring in factories. Women were left at home to take care of the home, the children, and of course the work in different ways, whether this was textiles, putting out system, thus the origin of the separate spheres. But again, before this time, women were out in public and women were talking, and it was more about class than gender. So poor people did not have as much of a voice. Those who had wealth, those who had property did, even if they were women. Now, by the middle of the 18th century, many colonists had grown weary of the English crown. Ideas of democracy, freedom, and equality had been designed during the Enlightenment, and these ideas were grasped by the colonists, especially folks like Tom Paine, James Madison, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Eventually, the colonists would succeed in the American Revolution, creating a new republic. It is important to remember that many of the colonists at this time considered themselves British. They had always practiced British culture. Many came directly from England, and the crown had held control over them for over a century. Many colonists did not want to challenge the crown and were happy to be secure in their lives. Others would risk their lives and their livelihoods to foment revolution. Now we know who won. But again, it is important to recognize that not every colonist wanted revolution. There were many loyalists. Now, the key to these early years is the idea of compromise. I've mentioned this already. We see it in many ways, beginning with the Constitutional Convention itself. This, of course, would be after the failed Articles of Confederation, or Articles of Confederation. I'm sorry, I don't know where I'm going with this. There were disagreements on how the government should be structured, who should lead, how much power a federal government should have, and just how to bring freedom, democracy, and equality to this new world. During a contentious convention, two groups separated themselves, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Now, the difference. Federalists wanted a strong central government, similar to that of England, only without a crown. Folks like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams were on the side and were prodded thusly by a guy named George Washington. Anti-Federalists wanted states' rights and less power in the federal government. They liked the Articles of Confederation in many ways. They just wanted to amend it. The Federalists would win out initially, but not without some compromise. The ideal of a balance of power, or checks and balances, would keep the executive branch from garnering too much power, as well as restrict the power of the legislature. Now, additionally, the Anti-Federalists pushed for what was a Bill of Rights. Now, this focused on personal liberty and specifically a restriction of federal power. The Federalists begrudgingly granted this in order to get the Constitution approved. Now, that's one compromise. But there was another major compromise. And of course, that gets back to slavery. Many ask why slavery was not ended with the Constitution, as obviously there is some hypocrisy involved when stating that all men are free and equal. But the only way to get the Constitution approved, and thus allow for the creation of the new nation at all, was to allow slavery to continue. Without it, the southern colonies would not have approved the Constitution, particularly the Carolinas. Many wanted it out, but it was just not yet feasible. This represents one failure of the time and theoretically a downside to compromise, but without it, who knows where we would be? We may have, would we have a federation of states? Would we have gone back to the Articles? And would it be something like what the Confederacy would end up creating? Slavery would have continued. It would have just been, again, it would have been kind of like two different countries, just like what the Confederacy tried to do during the Civil War. Now, one more thing here on the first video of this welcome video, the Revolution of 1800. And this is a significant event in American history. This reignited many of the tensions from the convention. Now, John Adams ran for a second term as president as a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson ran as a Democratic, Republican, or Anti-Federalist. There was an electoral tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, and the Federalists were up in arms. They believed that a Democratic Republican president would destroy all that had been built, that the election of either Burr or Jefferson would certainly be the ruin of the country. Does that sound familiar? Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, he did not like either Jefferson or Burr. Again, he's a Federalist. He wants a strong central government, and Jefferson and Burr are very much against that as Anti-Federalists. Hamilton did not like either, but he believed Jefferson would be the lesser of the two evils, and his politicking would actually help win the presidency for Jefferson, leaving Burr behind. Now, this is significant because, again, it is a major compromise. You have somebody who is in favor of a strong central government helping to get somebody who's against a strong central government elected as president. Now, he left Burr behind. Why is this important? Maybe Hamilton was right. Jefferson was the lesser of two evils. Burr would later challenge Hamilton to a duel because of this, shoot him, and kill him. Again, this shows the importance of compromise. Each party believed the other represented the worst of American politics, that the other would certainly destroy the nation, but in the end, the most ardent of Federalists stuck up for Anti-Federalists, believing the unity of the nation, however tenuous, was more important than his political party having power. And guess what? The nation survived, just like it'll survive now. We'll come back for a second welcome.